Issei Hyoudou opened his eyes to a white ceiling and the steady beep of a machine somewhere near his head. For a long moment he could not remember why his body felt so heavy, or why the air smelled faintly of antiseptic instead of the ramen shop 2 streets from his house. He tried to sit up and a jolt of pain ran through his side, sharp enough to make him hiss through his teeth. Careful. You have been asleep for 3 days. The voice belonged to Rias Gremery, though she looked different than he remembered. Gone was the school uniform. In its place was a long white coat over a dark blazer, an identification badge clipped to the collar, and an expression far more guarded than the warmth he associated with her. She stood at the foot of the bed with her arms crossed, watching him the way a scientist might watch an experiment that had finally stirred. Rias. His throat was dry, and the name came out cracked. What happened? Where is everyone? That is a very long story, she said. And you are the only person alive who needs to hear all of it. He blinked at her, certain he had misheard. The only person. The only man, she corrected quietly. Alive, that is. Issei stared at her, waiting for the joke, the punchline, anything that would make the words make sense. None came. Rias walked to the window and drew back the blinds, and for the first time he saw the city outside. It was Ko, or what used to be Ko, except the streets were too quiet, too orderly, patrolled by women in uniforms he did not recognize, banners hanging from lampposts with a red cross and the words Quarantine Zone 7 stenciled beneath it. 4 years ago a virus appeared, Rias said, her voice flat with the practiced calm of someone who had explained this too many times. It did not look dangerous at first. A fever, a rash, nothing that concerned anyone. But it targeted something specific in male physiology. Within 18 months, 99.99% of the male population on this planet was gone. That is not possible, Issei said, though even as he said it he understood that the world outside the window was proof enough. It is very possible, and it happened, Rias said. You survived because your body carries something the virus could not touch. We do not fully understand why yet. What we do understand is that you are, as far as any laboratory on this planet has been able to determine, the last biologically fertile human male left alive. Issei tried to process that sentence, and found that his mind refused to hold its shape. He thought of his parents, of his classmates, of Matsuda and Motohama who used to sit beside him at lunch trading terrible jokes about girls neither of them would ever work up the courage to speak to. He thought of his father's laugh and could not remember the last time he had heard it. My family, he said. My dad. Rias's expression softened, just slightly. I'm sorry, Issei. There was nothing anyone could do. He closed his eyes. The grief came in a wave too large to process all at once, so his mind did the only thing it could and set it aside. A locked door he would have to open eventually, but not yet, not while there were still questions he needed answered simply to understand what kind of world he had woken up into. Why am I in a research facility and not a hospital? He asked eventually. And why do you look like you work here instead of like you are still in high school? Because 4 years have passed since the outbreak began, not 4 days, Rias said. You were in a coma for most of your recovery. Your body fought something in your blood that the doctors still cannot fully explain, something that seems tied to whatever protected you from the virus in the first place. As for me, I finished my schooling, and when the Gremery family determined that our resources were needed here, I did not hesitate. The Gremery family, Issei repeated. So the devils are still around. The supernatural side of things did not disappear. No. If anything, our world has become more important, not less. Devils, angels, fallen angels, we do not carry the vulnerability that killed off human men. But we are far fewer in number than humanity, and the factions have all recognized what your survival means. A man who is not just alive, but whose biology appears resistant to the very thing that erased an entire gender. There is no faction on this planet, human or supernatural, that does not want to be the one who protects you. Or controls you, depending on who you ask. Issei swallowed. Protects me from what? From everyone else who wants to control you instead, Rias said simply. Come. There are people waiting who have been anxious to see you awake. And you should hear the rest of this from more than one person, because I promise you, Issei, Not everyone will tell you the same version of the truth. The room Rias led him to was not what Issei expected. He had imagined something clinical, all steel tables and harsh lighting, but instead it was warm, wood-paneled, with large windows that looked out over a courtyard where cherry trees stood in gentle rows. Waiting inside were 3 women he recognized immediately, and the sight of their faces undid something in his chest that he did not know had been wound tight. Issei. Asia Argento crossed the room before Rias had even finished opening the door, and threw her arms around him so quickly that he nearly lost his balance. She was crying before she said another word, her fingers gripping the back of his hospital gown like she was afraid he might vanish if she let go. You are awake. You are really awake, Asia. He hugged her back, feeling something in him settle for the first time since he had opened his eyes. I am sorry. I did not mean to worry you. You did not do it on purpose, said a quieter voice, and Kaneko Tuju stepped forward, her arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral in the way it always used to be when she was trying not to show how much she cared. But her eyes were red-rimmed, and Issei knew her well enough to see through the mask immediately. We thought you might not wake up at all. The doctor said the odds were not good. I am hard to kill, Issei said, trying for levity and mostly succeeding. Guess my body decided giving up was not an option. Your body did not have a choice, said the 3rd woman, and Issei turned to see Zenobia Corda leaning against the wall near the window, her arms folded, a small, genuine smile on her face that softened the usual sharpness of her features. She had grown taller in whatever years had passed, her hair longer, a sword at her hip that looked far more official than the training blade she used to carry. The whole facility has been running blood work on you nonstop since you arrived. Whatever is keeping you alive, it fought hard. It is good to see all of you, Issei said, and meant it more than words could easily carry. Rias told me some of what happened. About the virus. About my parents. The room went quiet. Asia's grip on his arm tightened. We looked for other survivors for a long time, Zenobia said. Male ones, I mean. There have been rumors, false hopes, isolated cases that turned out to be nothing. You are the only confirmed case in 4 years. Do you understand what that means? Rias tried to explain it, Issei said. I do not think I fully understand it yet. It means every government left standing, every church, every supernatural faction with enough political weight to matter, wants a say in what happens to you, Kaneko said bluntly. Some of them want to study you. Some of them want to marry into whatever bloodline comes from you. Some of them just want to make sure nobody else gets to you first. Issei felt his stomach drop. That sounds like I am being talked about as if I am not a person. That is exactly the problem, Rias said from the doorway, her voice edged with something like anger held carefully in check. It is why the Gremery family petitioned for you to recover here, under our protection, rather than in a government facility where you would have no say in anything that happened to you. We do not see you as a resource, Issei. We see you as someone who deserves to choose his own life. Not everyone agrees with that position. Then I choose, Issei said, surprising even himself with how steady his voice came out. I choose to stay with people I trust. People I already know. Asia let out a small, relieved laugh through her tears. That is very like you. Waking up in a completely different world and still making it about looking out for the people around you. Somebody has to, Issei said, and for the first time since opening his eyes, he managed something close to a real smile. Over the following days, Issei began to understand the shape of the world he had woken into. The virus, which the surviving scientific community had labeled the Sekai strain, had swept through the human population with a speed nobody had anticipated, and by the time any government managed to enact quarantine protocols with real teeth, the damage had already metastasized far beyond containment. What remained afterward was a planet almost entirely populated by women, its social and political structures rebuilt from the ground up in the aftermath of a catastrophe nobody had a name for before it happened. Devils, angels, and fallen angels had watched all of this from a position of relative safety, since the virus appeared to target something unique to human male biology, and left supernatural men, at first, largely untouched. That safety had not lasted. A second wave, less understood and far more selective, had begun to appear in supernatural bloodlines as well, and within another year the male population among devils, angels, and fallen angels alike had begun to dwindle at an alarming rate. Issei sat with Rias in her office one evening, papers and tablets spread across the desk between them, and tried to absorb the sheer scale of it. So it is not just humans, he said. It is everyone. It is everyone, Rias confirmed. Which is why your survival is treated as such a significant event. You are not simply the last human man standing. Current research suggests you may be the last fertile male across every known faction on this planet, human and supernatural both. Issei set down the tablet he had been holding, his hands unsteady. That is an impossible amount of pressure to put on one person. I agree, Rias said. And I am sorry that it has landed on you specifically. But I would rather you hear the truth from me plainly than have someone else feed you a version of it designed to manipulate you into doing what they want. Who else wants something from me? Issei asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would be a long list. The Vatican wants to bring you under church protection, framing it as a matter of faith and duty, Rias said, counting on her fingers. Several human governments have proposed international custody arrangements, dressed up in diplomatic language that really just means control. The Grigori want access to you for research on angelic and human hybridization. And that is only the parties who have gone through official channels. There are others who would prefer to simply take you, if given the opportunity. Take me, Issei repeated. Like a hostage. Like a resource, Rias said, and the word clearly tasted bitter in her mouth. I do not use that word to describe you, Issei. I want to be clear about that. But there are those who do, and it is why the Gremery House has taken your protection so seriously. It is not simply a matter of personal feeling for me, though that exists as well. It is a matter of making certain you are never treated as property by anyone, ever, for any reason. Issei looked at her for a long moment, seeing past the researcher's coat and the careful diplomatic language to the girl he remembered from Ko Academy, the one who used to fuss over his training regimen and laugh at his jokes even when they were not particularly funny. Thank you, he said quietly. For fighting for that. For me. Rias's composure cracked, just slightly, warmth breaking through the professional mask she had been wearing since he woke. You do not need to thank me for treating you like a human being, Issei. That should never have been in question in the first place. The first real trouble arrived 6 days after Issei woke, in the shape of a black transport convoy that rolled up to the facility gates flying a flag Issei did not recognize, gold and white with a stylized crest at its center. Rias was called away from a meeting the moment the vehicles appeared on the perimeter cameras, and Issei found himself standing at a window with Kaneko and Zenobia, watching uniformed figures step out of the lead vehicle with the unhurried confidence of people who expected to get what they came for. Who are they? Issei asked. Church-affiliated, Zenobia said, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword without any apparent thought, an old habit reasserting itself. Not the main branch I answer to. A splinter group calling themselves the Sanctum Compact. They believe a human male with your particular resistance should be under religious stewardship rather than devil protection. Stewardship, Kaneko said, her voice flat with distaste. That is a nice word for taking someone against their will. They cannot simply walk in and take him, Zenobia said, though there was tension in her shoulders that suggested she was less certain of that than she wanted to sound. Rias returned 20 minutes later, her jaw tight, flanked by 2 of her peerage members Issei did not recognize, tall women in dark tactical gear who moved like they had trained for exactly this kind of situation. They are requesting a formal audience, Rias said. Which is their polite way of saying they intend to make their case directly to Issei, and hope he agrees to leave with them voluntarily. I have already told them that is not going to happen, but their delegation leader is insisting. I can talk to them, Issei said. If it avoids a fight. Issei, they will use every trick available to make their offer sound appealing, Rias warned. They will talk about duty, about legacy, about the good you could do for humanity under their guidance. None of it will mention the fact that once you are inside their custody, the concept of you choosing anything for yourself quietly disappears. Then I will listen, and I will say no, Issei said. But I would rather face them and refuse clearly than hide behind a wall and let them assume I am too weak to speak for myself. Something in Rias's expression shifted, pride mixing with worry in equal measure. All right. But you will not go alone. The audience took place in the facility's main hall. The Sanctum Compact's delegation leader, a severe-looking woman named Sister Miriam Voss, who spoke with the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She laid out her case exactly as Rias predicted, framing Issei's survival as a divine mandate, humanity's chance to rebuild under proper guidance, his place at the center of a carefully managed program to ensure the continuation of the human race under the Church's watchful stewardship. When she finished, Issei let the silence stretch a moment before he answered. I appreciate that you believe what you are saying, he said. But you are talking about my life like it belongs to a program instead of to me. I did not survive a virus that killed almost every man on this planet just so I could hand my choices over to someone else the moment I woke up. Whatever happens next, I intend to decide it. Not you. Not anyone else who shows up with a flag and a speech. Sister Voss's expression did not change, but something in her posture stiffened. You are young. You do not yet understand the weight of what you represent. Maybe not, Issei admitted. But I understand what it feels like to have people talk about me instead of to me, and I do not intend to get used to it. The delegation left an hour later, without him, though the tension in the room did not fully dissolve until the convoy's taillights vanished past the perimeter gate. That night, Issei stood alone on the balcony outside his room, looking out over the quiet courtyard below, the cherry trees pale under the moonlight. The weight of the day sat heavy in his chest, not from fear exactly, but from the strange vertigo of understanding, all at once, that his life no longer belonged only to him in the simple way it once had. Every choice he made now rippled outward into a world desperate for stability, for a future it was not sure it still had. You did well today, said a voice behind him, and he turned to find Rias standing in the doorway, no longer in her lab coat, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look, for a moment, exactly like the girl he remembered from before everything changed. I do not feel like I did well, Issei admitted. I feel like I just made an enemy of a group with a lot of resources and a very specific interest in me. You made a boundary, Rias corrected gently, stepping out to join him at the railing. There is a difference. An enemy is someone who wants to hurt you. Sister Voss simply wanted you to comply. You refusing to comply does not make you responsible for whatever frustration follows. Issei was quiet for a moment, watching the wind move through the cherry blossoms. Can I ask you something honestly? Always. Why do you care this much? About protecting me, I mean. It has been 4 years. You built a whole life, a career, all before I even woke up. I could have been a stranger to you by now. Rias was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again her voice had lost its careful, professional edge entirely. Because I never stopped waiting for you to wake up, Issei. Every test I ran, every proposal I fought off from every faction that wanted a piece of you, I did because some part of me refused to accept a world where you simply did not come back. You were my friend before any of this happened. You still are. That does not disappear just because the world fell apart around us. Issei felt something in his chest tighten, gratitude and grief and something warmer than either tangled together into a feeling he did not entirely have a name for. Thank you, Rias. For everything. For not giving up on me. I would do it again, Rias said simply. As many times as it took. They stood together in comfortable silence after that, the cherry blossoms drifting on the night wind, and for the first time since waking into this strange, altered world, Issei allowed himself to believe that whatever came next, he would not have to face it alone. The weeks that followed settled into something resembling a routine, though nothing about Issei's new life could ever be called ordinary. Mornings began with medical checkups meant to track whatever biological quirk had spared him from the virus, followed by hours of briefings meant to bring him up to speed on a world that had rebuilt itself almost entirely without men in it. Afternoons were quieter, spent in the company of Asia, Kaneko, and Zenobia, each of whom seemed determined in her own way to make sure he was never left alone with his thoughts for too long. It was Asia who first suggested he see more of the facility beyond the medical wing, and it was Kaneko who insisted on coming along, muttering something about making sure he did not wander into a restricted section by accident. Zenobia joined without being asked, claiming she needed the exercise, though Issei suspected she simply did not want to be left out. They walked together through gardens that had been planted in the courtyard, past training yards where Devil Peerage members sparred under the afternoon sun, past a library wing stacked floor to ceiling with research on the Sekai strain that Issei did not yet have the stomach to read in detail. It was strange, walking through a world so thoroughly reshaped by loss, and yet finding, in the middle of it, small ordinary moments that felt almost like the life he used to have. "You are quiet," Kaneko observed as they paused near a fountain at the garden center, its water catching the afternoon light. "Just thinking," Issei said, "about how strange it is that the world can fall apart completely, and people still plant gardens in the middle of it." "That is not strange," Asia said gently. "That is what people do. Even when everything else is uncertain, we still want something beautiful to look at. Something worth taking care of." "She is right," Zenobia said, settling onto the fountain's edge, tilting her face toward the sun. The world needed something to hold on to after everything happened. For a lot of people, that ended up being small things like this. Gardens. Routines. Each other. Issei looked around at the three of them, each carrying scars from 4 years he had slept through entirely, each of them having rebuilt some version of a life in the wreckage of the old one, and felt a fierce, protective gratitude settle into his chest. "I am glad you are all still here," he said quietly. "I do not think I could have handled waking up into all of this without people I already knew standing beside me." "You will not have to find out," Kaneko said, and for the first time since he had woken, he saw her smile, small and genuine, entirely unguarded. "We are not going anywhere." The threat that had been building beneath the surface of Issei's new life finally broke into the open 1 month after he woke, in the form of a coordinated attempt on the facility itself. It came at night, without warning, a strike force moving with military precision through the outer perimeter before the first alarm even sounded. Issei woke to Rias's voice shouting his name, and the sound of something heavy slamming against reinforced walls somewhere deeper in the compound. "Stay behind me," Rias ordered, already dressed, a crimson light gathering around her hand that Issei recognized from stories she used to tell back at Ko Academy, the power of destruction passed down through her family line. "What is happening?" Issei demanded, pulling on whatever clothes were nearest as chaos erupted somewhere below them. "An extraction team," Rias said grimly. "Not the Sanctum Compact this time. Someone with far less patience for diplomacy." They moved together through corridors lit only by emergency lighting, Kaneko and Zenobia joining them at the first junction, both already armed and alert, the 4 of them forming a tight formation around Issei as they made for the facility's secure lower levels. The sounds of fighting grew louder as they went, shouts and the crackle of magic, and once, a sound like breaking stone that made Issei flinch. "There," Zenobia said, pointing toward a side corridor where 3 figures in dark tactical gear had cut off their path, faces hidden behind featureless masks, weapons raised. "Hand him over and no one else needs to get hurt," one of them said, voice distorted through some kind of vocal modulator. "That is not going to happen," Rias said, and the power of destruction around her hand flared brighter, close enough now that Issei could feel the air itself grow warm from it. The fight that followed was fast and brutal, Rias and Zenobia moving in coordinated bursts of magic and steel, while Kaneko darted between the attackers with a speed Issei could barely track, striking with enough force to send fully armored figures skidding across the corridor floor. Issei pressed himself against the wall, useless in the fight itself and painfully aware of it, watching the people who had sworn to protect him put themselves between him and harm without a moment's hesitation. It ended almost as quickly as it began, the attackers retreating rather than risk a prolonged engagement against 3 trained fighters who clearly had no intention of losing. Rias called for the facility's security teams to pursue and secure the perimeter, and only once the corridor had gone quiet again did she turn back to Issei, checking him over with the frantic thoroughness of someone who had genuinely feared the worst. "Are you hurt?" she demanded. "I am fine," Issei said. "Because none of you let anyone get close enough to hurt me." "That is the idea," Zenobia said, sheathing her sword, breathing hard from the fight but managing a tired grin anyway. "Though I would prefer if the next attempt gave us a little more warning." "Who sent them?" Issei asked, once his heartbeat had slowed enough to think clearly. "We do not know yet," Rias admitted. "But whoever it was, they were well trained, well equipped, and willing to strike a Gremry stronghold directly." That tells me this is not going to be the last attempt. Not by a long way. Issei looked at the three women standing around him, breathing hard, unhurt but clearly shaken by how close the night had come to going differently, and felt something settle into resolve inside his chest. Then I need to stop being someone you have to protect, he said. And start being someone who can stand and fight beside you instead. Ria studied him for a long moment, something like understanding passing across her face. That is a conversation worth having. But not tonight. Tonight you rest, and we make sure this facility is secure. Issei nodded, though the resolve in his chest did not fade, and as they made their way back through corridors slowly returning to order, he understood, with sudden clarity, that the world he had woken into was not one where he could afford to remain simply a person other people fought over. Whatever came next, he intended to meet it on his own 2 feet. Training began the morning after the attack, though it did not look anything like Issei expected. He had pictured something dramatic, sparring in some grand courtyard while devils clashed swords under a painted sky. What he got instead was Ria standing across from him in a plain training hall with padded floors, arms crossed, watching him do push-ups until his arms shook. "You are stronger than you were 4 years ago," she said, circling him slowly. "Coma or not, your body kept adapting somehow. But strength alone will not keep you alive if something like last night happens again." "Then teach me what will," Issei said, pushing himself up onto his knees, breathing hard. "That is exactly my intention," Ria said. "Which means we start with the one thing you already have and never learned to use properly." She nodded toward his left arm, and Issei looked down at it, unsure what she meant until a familiar green light flickered faintly along his forearm, gone as quickly as it appeared. "The boosted gear," Issei said slowly, memory surfacing through the fog of 4 lost years. "Drake. I had almost forgotten." "He has not forgotten you," Ria said. "Sacred gears like his do not simply vanish because their host falls unconscious. If anything, being dormant for 4 years may have given him time to settle deeper into your soul than he ever managed while you were still in school. Try calling him." Issei closed his eyes, reaching for a feeling he had not touched in years, and felt something answer from deep inside his chest, a presence old and vast and unmistakably alive. "Partner." "It has been a long time." The voice rumbled through his mind, and for a moment Issei nearly lost his balance from the sheer familiarity of it, a piece of his old life clicking back into place after everything else had been rearranged without his permission. "Drake," he said aloud, and heard Rias exhale in quiet relief across the room. "You are still here. I never left. I simply had nothing worth commenting on while you slept. Now that you are awake, I imagine that will change quickly." "You have no idea," Issei muttered, and for the first time since waking into this new world, he laughed, short and surprised, but genuine. Rias watched the exchange with careful attention. "What does he say?" "He says he never left," Issei said. "And that things are about to get complicated." "They already are," Rias said. "But at least now you are not facing that complication without every tool you have. Come. If Drake is still with you, we start relearning how to use the boosted gear properly, starting today." The days that followed blurred together into a rhythm of exhaustion and slow, hard-won progress. Issei trained through mornings that left his muscles screaming and afternoons spent in Drake's patient, gravelly guidance, learning to call the gauntlet at will instead of only in moments of desperate crisis. Kaneko supervised his physical conditioning with a discipline that surprised him, correcting his stance with quiet, blunt criticism that somehow motivated him more than encouragement ever could have. Zenobia taught him the basics of close combat, insisting that a sacred gear meant nothing if its user could not survive long enough to use it properly. It was Akino Himejima who arrived nearly 2 weeks into his training, stepping into the hall one afternoon in dark tactical gear that looked nothing like the school uniform Issei remembered, though her smile was exactly as warm and faintly teasing as it had always been. "Look at you," she said, circling him with open amusement, while Rias watched from the sidelines. "Working so hard. It is almost like you are trying to impress someone." "Akino," Issei said, relief washing through him at the sight of another familiar face. "I did not know you were coming." "I have been coordinating with border facilities for the past year," Akino said. "Keeping certain factions honest, you might say." But Rias asked for my help once she heard how determined you were to stop being someone who needs protecting. I did not say it quite like that, Issei protested, though he could not entirely deny the sentiment. You did not have to, Akino said, her smile sharpening slightly. I read the incident report from the attack. You stood in that corridor doing nothing while 3 people fought to keep you safe. I imagine that did not sit well with you at all. It did not, Issei admitted. Good, Akino said. Because doing nothing is not who you were before all of this happened, and I do not intend to let you become someone who accepts it now. Show me what Drake has taught you so far. What followed was the hardest sparring session Issei had faced since waking, Akino's lightning crackling close enough to singe the air around him as she pushed him past every limit he thought he had, correcting his footwork between strikes, forcing him to think even as his body screamed for rest. By the end of it he was on the floor, breathing hard, but grinning despite the ache in every muscle. Better, Akino said, offering a hand to pull him up. You have a long way to go. But better. High praise coming from you, Issei said. Do not get used to it, Akino said, though her smile suggested she meant the opposite. Drake spoke to him most clearly in the quiet hours after training, when Issei lay staring at the ceiling of his room, too exhausted to sleep and too restless to simply let his mind go still. You are asking yourself why you survived a virus that erased nearly every man on this planet, human and otherwise. I can hear the question even when you do not say it aloud. Can you blame me? Issei said quietly. Everyone keeps telling me how unlikely it is. How impossible. Nobody has an actual answer. I have a theory. Whether you want to hear it tonight is a different matter entirely. Issei sat up. Tell me. The Sekai strain did not simply appear from nowhere, partner. Something with intention shaped it, something old enough and powerful enough to reach into human and supernatural biology alike and carve away an entire gender with surgical precision. I have felt something like that intention before, a very long time ago, in a war fought before your kind kept written records of such things. Issei's stomach tightened. You are saying someone did this on purpose. Not a natural disaster. A weapon. I am saying it is possible, and that the possibility deserves serious attention rather than dismissal. Whatever protected you from the strain's effects may be connected to why I was bound to your soul in the first place. Draconic essence does not yield easily to viral manipulation, even manipulation shaped by something ancient and clever. Then whoever is behind this might come looking for me eventually, Issei said slowly. Not just because I am the last fertile man alive. Because I am the one who slipped through whatever they built. That is precisely the conclusion I have reached as well. I would advise telling Rias. Issei was quiet for a long moment, turning the thought over, weighing the fear against the responsibility of carrying it alone versus sharing a burden he could not yet prove. If I tell her, everyone is going to want to prepare for something we cannot even see coming yet. Better to prepare for a threat that may never fully arrive than to be caught unprepared by one that does, partner. You already learned that lesson once, standing helpless in a corridor while others fought for you. Do not force yourself to learn it twice. Issei let out a slow breath, and swung his legs out of bed. You are right. I will tell her in the morning. Good. Now sleep. Whatever is coming will still be there when you wake, and you will face it better rested than exhausted. Rias listened to Drake's theory the next morning without interrupting once, her expression growing more troubled with every sentence Issei relayed. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers scattered across her desk without truly seeing them. That is not a comforting thought, she finally said. But it does align with something that has bothered our research division since the beginning. The Sekai strain behaved unlike any natural virus we have on record. Its selectivity was too precise. Something engineered it, or guided it, and we never had a strong enough lead to determine what. Drake thinks it might be something ancient, Issei said. Something he has encountered before, a long time ago. If that is true, it changes everything about how we need to handle your protection, Rias said. It means this was never only about political factions competing over your biology. It may mean something out there deliberately created the conditions that led to you existing as the last one, and I do not like what that implies about its intentions going forward. You think it wants me specifically, Issei said. I think we cannot afford to assume otherwise, Rias said. I am calling a meeting with my peerage, and I want you present for it. If there is a threat larger than the political factions we have been managing so far, we need every advantage we can gather, and that includes information you and Drake can offer that nobody else in this facility has access to. The meeting convened that evening in the same warm, wood-paneled room where Issei had first reunited with Asia, Kaneko, and Zenobia, though the mood this time carried none of the relief from that first day. Akino sat beside Rias, expression sharp and focused. Asia listened with her hands folded tightly in her lap, worry playing on her face. Kaneko's usual stoicism had hardened into something colder, more alert. Zenobia leaned forward with the intensity of someone already calculating how to prepare for a fight that had not yet arrived. If Drake's instincts are correct, we are dealing with something significantly older and more dangerous than any faction currently competing for Issei's custody, Rias said, laying out the theory plainly. I want us prepared for that possibility, even without confirmation. That means expanding Issei's training, strengthening the facility's defenses, and reaching out carefully to allies who might have relevant historical knowledge. The Grigori keep extensive records on ancient threats, Akino said. If something like this has appeared before, they would likely have documentation, assuming they are willing to share it. They will want something in return, Zenobia said. The Grigori do not simply hand over information out of generosity. Then we negotiate, Rias said. Carefully, and on our own terms. I am not willing to let fear of manipulation stop us from gathering information that could keep Issei alive. Issei looked around the room at each of them, weighing risks and strategies on his behalf without a hint of hesitation, and felt the same fierce gratitude from before settle deeper into something closer to determination. Whatever we decide, he said, I want to be part of the planning. Not just the person everyone is protecting while decisions get made around me. Rias met his eyes, and nodded once, firm and certain. Agreed. You have earned that much, Issei. And more. The invitation from the Grigori arrived faster than anyone expected, delivered by a young fallen angel messenger with dark wings and a nervous demeanor who clearly understood she was walking into a den of devils on a diplomatic errand that could go badly in a dozen different ways. She requested, on behalf of Governor General Azazel, a face-to-face meeting to discuss what she described only as matters of mutual concern regarding recent global instability. Azazel does not typically involve himself directly unless something has caught his attention in a serious way, Akino said, studying the sealed letter with narrowed eyes. This is either a very good sign or a very concerning one. Possibly both, Rias said. Azazel has always had a talent for finding the most interesting angle in any crisis. If he has noticed patterns in the Sekai strain that concern him enough to reach out directly, we should take that seriously. The meeting took place 3 days later in neutral territory, a converted research station on the border between Devil and Fallen Angel-controlled zones, its halls lined with monitoring equipment and staffed by personnel from both factions working in careful, practiced cooperation. Azazel himself greeted them personally, his casual demeanor doing little to disguise the sharp intelligence behind his eyes as he studied Issei with open curiosity. So you are the one causing all this fuss, Azazel said, grinning in a way that managed to be both amused and entirely serious at once. The last man standing. I have read your file more times than I would like to admit. Please sit. We have a lot to discuss, and not much time to waste on pleasantries. What followed was a long, careful exchange of information, Azazel producing records from the Grigori's extensive archives that detailed historical instances of engineered biological catastrophes stretching back further than Issei had imagined possible, ancient conflicts fought not with armies but with carefully designed plagues meant to cripple entire populations without a single blade drawn. There is a pattern here that concerns me, Azazel said, spreading several documents across the table between them. Every instance we have on record shares one detail in common. In each case, a small number of survivors displayed resistance traits similar to what we are seeing in you, Issei. And in every single instance, those survivors were eventually targeted directly by whatever force orchestrated the original catastrophe. Targeted for what purpose? Rias asked, her voice tight with controlled tension. That varies, Azazel said. Sometimes to eliminate a loose end. Sometimes for something considerably worse. There is a theory, old and largely unproven, That certain ancient entities view resistant survivors as valuable specifically because their biology represents something these entities cannot easily replicate or control. In simpler terms, Issei's survival may not just be an inconvenience to whatever caused the Sekai strain. It may be exactly what they were hoping to find. The room went very quiet. Issei felt a chill settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "You are saying I might have been the target all along," he said slowly. "Not an accident. Not a random survivor. The whole point. I am saying it is a strong enough possibility that dismissing it would be reckless," Azazel said, his usual levity fading into something far more serious. "I do not have definitive proof yet. But I have survived long enough to trust patterns like this one, and this pattern worries me considerably." The journey back to the facility passed in near silence, each member of Rias's peerage lost in their own thoughts about what Azazel's information meant for the path ahead. Issei sat by the window, watching the ruined landscape pass beneath the transport, cities rebuilt in fragments, populations concentrated into carefully managed zones, the whole shape of the world reorganized around a catastrophe that might have been engineered specifically to produce him. "You are quiet," Asia said gently, settling into the seat beside him. "I do not know what to feel," Issei admitted. "Everyone I love is gone because of something that might have wanted to find me specifically. That is not the kind of thing you process easily." "No," Asia agreed. "It is not. But Issei, listen to me. Whatever caused this, whatever wanted you, it does not get to decide what you become because of it. You are not obligated to become whatever role this entity imagined for you. You get to choose who you are, no matter how this began." Issei looked at her, struck by the quiet certainty in her voice. "How do you always know exactly what to say?" Asia smiled, soft and a little shy despite everything they had survived together. "I do not always know. I just refuse to let you believe you are only what happened to you. You have always been more than that, even back when we first met, when you were just a boy at Ko Academy trying to figure out how to be brave. I am glad you are still here," Issei said quietly. "Through all of this, I would not be anywhere else," Asia said simply, and reached over to squeeze his hand, a small, steady comfort against the enormity of everything Azazel had told them. Across the transport, Rias watched the exchange with an expression Issei could not quite read, something complicated moving behind her eyes before she turned back to the window, her jaw set with the particular determination he had come to recognize whenever she was already 3 steps ahead, planning how to protect the people she considered hers. "We will need allies beyond the Grigori," she said finally, breaking the silence. "If something ancient and deliberate caused this, we cannot face it with devils and fallen angels alone. I intend to reach out to the church as well, formally this time, through proper channels rather than splinter groups like the Sanctum Compact. They tried to take Issei from us not long ago," Zenobia pointed out. "The Sanctum Compact tried," Rias corrected. "The main church body has not made a move at all, which tells me they are either cautious or simply waiting to see how this unfolds. If Azazel is right about the scale of what we are facing, caution will not serve any of us well. We need every faction with relevant knowledge working together, not competing over who gets custody of one person." "That is a difficult alliance to build," Aquino said. "Devils, fallen angels, and the church working together is not exactly a long tradition." "No," Rias agreed. "But neither is a virus engineered to erase nearly every man on the planet in search of one survivor. Difficult does not mean impossible. It simply means we start now, before whatever is coming arrives and makes the choice for us." The formal approach to the church took the shape of a summit, held 2 weeks later in a converted cathedral that had survived the worst of the outbreak's chaos relatively intact, its stained glass windows casting colored light across a gathering of representatives from factions that had spent centuries treating each other as enemies rather than potential allies. Issei stood near Rias as delegates filed into the Great Hall, devils and fallen angels and church knights occupying careful, deliberate distance from one another, old habits of suspicion evident in every posture and glance. It was Irina Shida who broke the tension first, striding across the hall the moment she spotted Issei, her face lighting up with a joy so unguarded it seemed to genuinely surprise several of the more severe-looking clergy standing nearby. "Issei, you are actually here! I heard you woke up, but I did not quite believe it until now. Irina, Issei said, startled into a laugh as she nearly tackled him with the force of her hug, exactly as enthusiastic as he remembered her from their school days, if slightly more restrained by the formal uniform she now wore. It is good to see you too. I have prayed for you every single day, Irina said, pulling back just enough to look at him properly, her eyes suspiciously bright. I knew you would wake up eventually. God does not waste a miracle like your survival on nothing. That remains to be seen, Issei said carefully, thinking of Azazel's warning, though he did not have the heart to dampen Irina's obvious relief with the darker theory hanging over all of them. The summit itself proceeded with careful, formal diplomacy, delegates from each faction presenting their concerns and their evidence, while Rias, flanked by her peerage and by Issei himself, argued the case for cooperation over competition. It was slow, difficult work, old grievances surfacing more than once, suspicion coloring every proposal exchanged across the hall. But by the summit's end, a fragile framework had taken shape, an agreement to share information and resources in the face of a threat none of them fully understood yet, devils and fallen angels and church representatives committing, however cautiously, to something resembling unified purpose. That went better than I expected, Zenobia admitted afterward, watching delegates file out of the cathedral in small, wary clusters. Better does not mean good, Ria said, rubbing her temples with the exhaustion of someone who had spent hours holding a fragile piece together through sheer force of will. But it is a foundation. We will need every piece of it if Azazel's fears turn out to be accurate. Irina lingered behind as the hall emptied, falling into step beside Issei as they made their way toward the exit. I want to help, she said. Whatever this threat turns out to be, I want to be part of protecting you, Issei. Properly this time. Not from a distance. I would like that, Issei said, and meant it. It is good to have familiar faces close by, especially with everything Azazel told us hanging over all of this. Then it is settled, Irina said, brightening considerably. I will speak to my superiors about a formal transfer. Consider me recruited. It was nearly a month later, in the quiet hours of a night that had started like any other, when the threat Azazel warned them about finally showed its hand. The attack came without the clumsy, brute force approach of the Sanctum Compact or the coordinated military precision of the earlier extraction team. This time, the facility's outer wards simply failed all at once, alarms dying mid-signal as something moved through the perimeter with an ease that suggested it had never truly needed to break in at all. Issei woke to Drake's voice sounding in his mind before any human alarm reached him. Partner, wake now. Something is here, and it does not feel like anything human or ordinary devil. He was on his feet and moving before he had fully processed the warning, the boosted gear already materializing along his arm in a flare of green light as he threw open his door to find Rias already in the hallway, power of destruction crackling around her clenched fist, her expression grim in a way he had not seen since the night of the first attack. You feel it too, she said. Drake felt it before I did, Issei said. He says it is not human or ordinary devil. No, Rias agreed. It is not. They found it in the facility's central courtyard, standing motionless among the cherry trees Issei had walked past so many times over the previous weeks, a figure that seemed to bend the moonlight around itself, its shape shifting at the edges as though reality itself struggled to hold a fixed image of whatever it truly was. When it finally spoke, its voice carried an echo that seemed to originate from several directions at once. So this is the one who slipped through, it said, and though it had no clearly defined face, Issei felt the weight of its attention settle on him like a physical pressure. Interesting. The strain was thorough everywhere else. You should not exist. Who are you? Rias demanded, stepping between the figure and Issei without hesitation, crimson energy gathering in both hands now. A question with a longer answer than you have time to hear tonight, the figure said, something like amusement threading through the layered echo of its voice. You may call me Rivos, if a name matters to you. I have come to see for myself what managed to survive a process that erased every other possibility across this entire world. You made the virus, Issei said, understanding crystallizing into cold certainty even as Drake confirmed the presence's ancient, alien nature through the bond between them. I shaped the conditions that made it possible, Rivos said. Whether you call that making it is a matter of philosophy I do not intend to debate at this hour. What I want, Issei Hyoudou, is considerably simpler. I want to understand what allowed you to slip through a process designed to leave nothing behind. And I intend to find out, one way or another. Rias's power of destruction flared brighter, a clear warning. You will not touch him. Irivos's shifting form seemed to regard her with something like patient indifference. Brave words, little devil. But I did not come tonight to fight. I came to look. Consider this an introduction rather than a confrontation. You will see me again, and next time, I suspect the outcome will depend far more on how prepared you have managed to become. Before Rias could respond, the figure simply dissolved, moonlight rushing back into the space it had occupied as though it had never truly been solid at all, leaving the courtyard silent and still, cherry blossoms drifting undisturbed in its wake. The facility descended into controlled chaos in the hours following Irivos's appearance, security teams sweeping every inch of the compound for signs of intrusion, while Rias convened an emergency meeting that stretched well past dawn. Azazel arrived within hours of being contacted, his usual levity entirely absent as he listened to Issei and Rias describe the encounter in exhaustive detail. Irivos, Azazel repeated, testing the name against decades of archived knowledge. I have heard fragments of that name before, buried in records old enough that most scholars dismiss them as myth rather than history. If this is the same entity, we are dealing with something that predates most of what either devils or fallen angels consider ancient history. Can it be fought? Rias asked bluntly. Everything can be fought, Azazel said. Whether it can be beaten is an entirely different question, and I do not have an honest answer for you yet. What I can tell you is that an entity capable of engineering a catastrophe on the scale of the Sekai strain, and still finding time for a casual midnight visit is not something any single faction is prepared to face alone. Then we accelerate the alliance, Rias said. Every faction we spoke with at the summit needs to understand exactly what we are dealing with now. This is no longer a hypothetical threat we are preparing against. It has already made contact. Issei sat through the meeting largely in silence, replaying Irivos's words in his mind. The casual certainty in its voice when it claimed his survival was something it intended to understand no matter what it took. He thought of his parents, of every man on the planet erased so thoroughly that 4 years later he remained the only confirmed exception, all of it apparently orchestrated as a kind of vast, patient experiment by something old enough that even Azazel's extensive knowledge could only offer fragments in response. I want to get stronger, Issei said finally, cutting through the strategic discussion with quiet, unshakable resolve. Not eventually. Now. If that thing comes back expecting to find easy answers, I want it to find something it did not expect instead. Drake's voice rumbled low in agreement, audible only to him. Now that, partner, is exactly the attitude I have been waiting to hear. Rias studied him for a long moment, something fierce and proud moving behind her eyes despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her posture. Then we train harder than we have been. All of us. If Irivos intends to return, I want it walking into a fight it did not anticipate, not a target it can study at its leisure. Around the table, Akino's expression sharpened into focus, Kaniko's jaw set with quiet determination, Zenovia's hand drifting instinctively to the hilt of her sword, Asia's worry tempered by steady resolve, and even Irina, present as an observer from the church delegation, nodded firmly in silent commitment. Whatever Irivos is, Issei said, looking around at each of them in turn, it made one mistake tonight. It let us know it was coming. We are not going to waste that warning. Outside, the sun rose slowly over a facility already stirring with renewed purpose, the cherry blossoms in the courtyard undisturbed by the visitation that had passed through them only hours before, though nothing about the world within those walls would feel quite as settled again until the question Irivos posed that night finally found its answer. The War Council convened 3 days after Irivos vanished from the courtyard, and this time the room was too small for everyone who needed a seat at the table. Sona Citri arrived at the head of a small delegation from her own peerage, her glasses catching the light as she surveyed the gathered faces with the same calculating precision Issei remembered from her days as student council president, though nothing about her bearing now suggested a school administrator. She looked like exactly what she was, a devil of significant house standing who had spent 4 years learning to think in terms of strategy and survival. Rias filled me in on the broad strokes, Sona said, setting a folder of her own research on the table. An ancient entity capable of engineering a species-wide catastrophe, apparently interested in the one survivor who slipped through its design. I want to be direct with all of you. This is not a threat any single house, or even a coalition of houses, is equipped to face without significant preparation. That is why we are here, Rias said. To build that preparation properly, instead of reacting piecemeal every time Arivos decides to make an appearance. Agreed, Sona said. Which means we need better intelligence, better defensive infrastructure, and a training program for Issei that goes beyond what a handful of individual mentors can provide on an ad hoc basis. I have already reached out to Rausweiss. She has experience training combatants under far more disciplined conditions than anything currently happening in this facility. No offense intended. None taken, Rias said dryly. If it keeps Issei alive, I will take help from anyone willing to offer it. Issei sat quietly through the exchange, watching 2 women who had once simply been his classmates now speak with the fluent authority of people responsible for the survival of entire populations. It was strange, watching how thoroughly the last 4 years had reshaped everyone around him while he had slept through all of it, waking into a world where the people he knew had already become versions of themselves he barely recognized in some ways and recognized completely in others. There is something else, Sona continued, opening her folder. My research division cross-referenced Azazel's archived material with our own historical records. We found 3 additional cases across recorded history that matched the pattern he described, cultures reduced to near extinction by a sudden, selective catastrophe, followed by contact with a survivor who displayed unusual resistance. What happened to those survivors? Issei asked, dreading the answer even as he needed to hear it. Sona's expression did not soften. In 2 cases, the survivor was taken, and the historical record simply ends there, no further mention, no explanation. In the 3rd case, the survivor fought back, with the aid of allies willing to commit fully to the conflict, and the entity involved was driven off, though not destroyed. Driven off, Rias repeated. Not defeated. No, Sona said. Every record we have found suggests these entities are extraordinarily difficult to permanently eliminate. But they can be forced to retreat, if the resistance mounted against them is significant enough. Issei looked around the table at the faces gathered there, Rias and Aquino, Kaneko and Zenobia, Asia's quiet determination, Irina representing the Church's cautious new cooperation, Sona's sharp strategic focus, and felt something settle into place inside him, a resolve that had been building since the moment Arivos first spoke his name in that quiet courtyard. Then that is our goal, Issei said. Not to be victims of whatever this thing intends. To be the resistance significant enough to drive it off. Ravel Phoenix arrived a week later, descending from a sleek transport with all the composed elegance Issei remembered from the few times their paths had crossed years ago, though the confidence in her bearing now carried the weight of someone who had spent years managing significant responsibility rather than simply representing a prestigious house name. Issei Hyoudou, she said, extending a gloved hand with formal precision that did not entirely mask the warmth beneath it. It has been a very long time. I am glad to see the reports of your survival were not exaggerated. Ravel, Issei said, shaking her hand, struck by how much older she looked, how much more settled into herself. Thank you for coming. The Phoenix family takes an interest in matters of significant magical consequence, Ravel said, though the careful diplomatic phrasing did little to disguise the genuine concern beneath it. And I confess my interest here is not purely political. I remember you as more than a footnote in a political calculation, Issei. I would like to help, if my family's resources prove useful. They will, Rias said, stepping forward to greet her with the particular respect that existed between rival but ultimately allied devil houses. The Phoenix healing techniques could prove invaluable if this conflict escalates the way we expect it to. Then consider us committed, Ravel said. My family has already lost enough to sit on the sidelines of something this significant. If there is a chance to prevent further loss, we intend to be part of that effort. Over the following days, Ravel's presence added a new dimension to the facility's preparations, her knowledge of Phoenix regenerative techniques woven into the medical division's protocols, her sharp political instincts proving useful in navigating the increasingly delicate diplomacy required to keep the fragile alliance between devils, fallen angels, and the church functioning smoothly. She and Issei fell into an easy rapport, old familiarity resurfacing quickly despite the years and the catastrophe that separated the boy she remembered from the man now training relentlessly to become something capable of standing against an ancient threat. "You have changed," Ravel observed one evening, watching him work through a set of exercises Rossweiss had assigned before her own arrival, precision drills meant to build the discipline his natural talent had never required before. "Everyone keeps telling me that," Issei said, pausing to catch his breath. "I am not sure I always believe it. Some days I still feel like the same person who used to get flustered talking to pretty girls at school." Ravel's laugh was soft, genuine. "Perhaps some things do not need to change. But you carry yourself differently now. More weight on your shoulders, certainly, but also more purpose. I think the version of you sleeping through those 4 years would be proud of who woke up in his place." Issei considered that for a long moment, turning the thought over with the same careful attention he had learned to give every idea that touched on the strange, disorienting gap between the life he remembered and the one he now lived. "I hope so," he said finally. "Because I do not think I am done changing yet. Not with what is coming." "None of us are," Ravel said quietly, watching the training yard where Kaneko and Zenobia sparred nearby, where Akino's lightning occasionally flashed against the darkening sky, where an entire fragile coalition worked, day after day, toward a fight none of them fully understood yet. "But I would rather change alongside people I trust than face the alternative alone." A summons arrived from the underworld itself less than a week later, delivered with a formality that made Rias visibly tense the moment she read it. Seraphal Leviathan, one of the 4 reigning Satans, had requested a personal audience with Issei, a request that could not easily be declined given the political weight behind it. "She is not dangerous to you," Rias said, though the tightness in her shoulders suggested the meeting worried her regardless. "Seraphal has always had a soft spot for Sona, and by extension for the people Sona trusts. But she does not make personal requests lightly, and when a Satan wants to speak with you directly, the entire underworld pays attention to how that conversation goes." The audience took place in a chamber far grander than anything Issei had encountered since waking, high vaulted ceilings and ancient stonework that spoke to a civilization far older than the human world he remembered, though Seraphal herself greeted him with a warmth that immediately cut through the intimidating formality of her surroundings. "So you are the miracle everyone keeps whispering about," she said, studying him with open, unguarded curiosity, her playful demeanor doing little to disguise the sharp intelligence beneath it. "Sona speaks highly of you. That is rare enough that I wanted to see for myself what all the fuss is about." "I do not feel much like a miracle most days," Issei admitted. "Few miracles do," Seraphal said, her expression sobering. "Issei, I want to be honest with you, because I think you have earned that honesty after everything you have survived. The underworld lost nearly as many devils to the second wave of the Sekai strain as humanity lost men in the first. We are a fractured, grieving civilization doing our best to hold together a semblance of order, and your survival represents something many of my people desperately want to believe in. Hope that this catastrophe can eventually be undone, or at least prevented from happening again." "That is a heavy thing to represent," Issei said quietly. "It is," Seraphal agreed. "Which is exactly why I wanted to meet you myself, rather than simply reading reports about you. I needed to see whether the person carrying that hope was strong enough to bear its weight, or whether my people were pinning their future on someone who would break under it." "And what do you think?" Issei asked. Seraphal studied him for a long moment, then smiled, small and genuine. "I think Rias chose well when she decided to protect you from every faction that wanted to reduce you to a resource. I think you have people around you who will not let you break, even when the weight becomes unbearable. That is enough for me. You have the full support of the underworld's leadership, Issei, for whatever that is worth against something like Erivos." "It is worth a great deal," Rias said. "Thank you, Seraphal." "Do not thank me yet," Seraphal said, her playful tone returning even as something serious lingered behind her eyes. "Thank me once we have actually won. Until then, all I have given you is permission to keep fighting. The fighting itself is still entirely up to all of you. Rossweiss training methods were, without exception, the most brutal Issei had endured since waking. She arrived from what remained of Valhalla's surviving military structure with a discipline forged through years of Norse combat doctrine, and she showed no patience whatsoever for what she considered the sloppy, instinct-driven fighting style Issei had relied on before his coma. Instinct will get you killed against something ancient enough to have watched empires rise and fall, she said flatly, circling him in the training hall while he struggled to catch his breath after yet another failed attempt to properly summon the boosted gear's balance breaker form. Erebos does not fight like a human opponent, or even like a typical supernatural one. It has had eons to study exactly the kind of predictable, emotional responses you keep falling back on. I am trying, Issei said, frustration bleeding into his voice despite his best effort to keep it contained. Trying is not the same as succeeding, Rosweiss said, though something in her tone softened slightly. But you are closer than you realize. Drake tells me the balance breaker requires more than raw desire to protect the people around you. It requires absolute certainty in your own right to stand and fight, not merely a willingness to sacrifice yourself for others. Drake's voice rumbled in agreement, audible only to Issei. She is correct, partner, though I suspect she does not fully understand how difficult that certainty is for you to reach. You spent your whole life believing your worth came from what you could do for others. The balance breaker asks something different of you. It asks you to believe your own survival matters as much as everyone else's. That should not be a difficult thing to believe, Issei muttered under his breath. And yet it clearly is, Drake said, not unkindly. Which is precisely why we continue training instead of simply declaring the problem solved. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived not during a formal training session but in a quiet moment 3 days later, when Issei sat alone in the courtyard where Erebos had first appeared, turning over Rosweiss' words and Drake's patient observations in his mind. He thought of his parents, gone before he ever woke to say goodbye. He thought of every man on the planet, erased in a catastrophe that might have been engineered specifically to find him. He thought of Rias and Aquino and Asia and Kaneko and Zenobia and Irina and Ravel, all of them fighting fiercely for a future that included him in it, not simply as a resource to protect but as a person worth protecting. And for the first time since waking, he allowed himself to believe, fully and without hesitation, that his own survival was not an accident to apologize for, but a fact worth defending with everything he had. The boosted gear's light flared brighter than it ever had before, green scales spreading rapidly across his arm and then his shoulder, and then his chest, the scale mail's familiar armored form finally settling into place around him with a resonance that felt, for the first time, entirely his own rather than borrowed. There it is, partner, Drake said, satisfaction evident even through the mental bond. Welcome back to yourself. Kaneko found him later that same afternoon, sitting alone near the fountain in the garden where they had walked together weeks earlier, still faintly winded from the effort of holding the balance breaker's form for the first time. She sat down beside him without a word, her presence quiet and steady in the way it had always been, even back when they were both students who did not yet understand how much the world was about to ask of them. You did not congratulate me earlier, Issei said, glancing at her sideways. Everyone else did. I do not congratulate people for things they still need to work harder at, Kaneko said, though there was no real edge in it. You found something important today. That matters more than a compliment. Issei huffed a tired laugh. That is very like you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fountain's water catching the afternoon light, before Kaneko spoke again, her voice quieter than before. I used to be afraid of what would happen if you never woke up, she said. I do not usually say things like that out loud. But I think you should know it anyway. Issei looked at her, surprised by the sudden openness. Kaneko, I spent a long time being afraid of my own strength before I met you, she continued, staring at the water rather than at him. Afraid of what I might become if I let it out completely. You were the first person who made me feel like strength did not have to be something dangerous. Watching you sleep for 4 years, not knowing if you would ever wake up, I was afraid I had lost that before I even finished learning how to trust it. I'm sorry, Issei said quietly. For all the years I was not here. You do not have to apologize for surviving something that was not your fault, Kaneko said. I just wanted you to understand why today mattered to me. You are not only fighting to protect the rest of us anymore. You found a reason to believe you deserve to survive this, too. That is the version of you I was waiting to see wake up. Issei felt something tighten in his chest, gratitude too large for easy words. Thank you, Kaneko. For waiting. For everything. She allowed herself a small, rare smile, resting her head briefly against his shoulder before straightening again, composure sliding back into place like a familiar coat. Do not make me say all of that again, she said. Once is enough. Understood, Issei said, smiling despite the ache still lingering in his chest from the day's breakthrough, grateful beyond words for a friendship that had survived 4 years of silence without losing a single ounce of its quiet, steady warmth. Word of Issei's breakthrough spread through the facility quickly, and Rias called for a full demonstration the following morning. The entire War Council gathered at the edge of the training yard as Issei summoned the balance breaker again, green armor gleaming under the pale morning sun. That is significant progress, Sona said, studying the armor with clinical interest. Though a single balance breaker will not be enough against something with Erivos' apparent power. We need to understand how it holds up under real pressure, not simply in a controlled demonstration. As if summoned by the thought itself, the facility's perimeter alarms shrieked to life, a pattern of alerts Issei had learned to recognize as distinct from ordinary security drills, sharp and urgent in a way that raised the hair on the back of his neck even before Rias's expression hardened into focus. That is not a drill, Aquino said, already moving toward the security terminal built into the yard's edge. The report that came through moments later described a small force of shadow constructs, humanoid shapes woven from something that was not quite darkness and not quite solid matter, advancing on the facility's outer perimeter with a coordinated purpose that suggested intelligent direction rather than simple mindless aggression. Erivos' creations, Rosweiss said grimly. A test, most likely, meant to gauge our readiness rather than mount a serious assault. Then let us give it a readiness worth reporting back, Zenobia said, already drawing her sword, a fierce grin spreading across her face despite the tension in the yard. The battle that followed was Issei's first real test in the balance breaker's armor, the shadow constructs proving faster and more resilient than their insubstantial appearance suggested, absorbing blows that would have shattered ordinary opponents, and reforming from strikes that should have ended them outright. Kaneko's enhanced strength sent constructs scattering in bursts of dissolving shadow, only for fragments to reconstitute moments later. Aquino's lightning arced between multiple targets at once, buying precious seconds rather than permanent victories. Zenovia's blessed blade proved more effective than most, each strike leaving a wound the shadow struggled to repair, though even her sword could not fully banish the things. It was Issei, finally, who found the answer, Drake's voice guiding him through the chaos. They are not truly alive, partner. They are extensions of Erivos' will given temporary form. Strike with intent, not merely force, and you will find they cannot sustain themselves against a will stronger than the one that created them. Issei focused everything he had, every ounce of the certainty he had only just learned to claim as his own, and drove his armored fist through the nearest construct with a boosted strike that carried more than physical force behind it. The shadow did not simply scatter this time. It unraveled entirely, dissolving into nothing and refusing to reform, and one by one, as Issei moved through the remaining constructs with the same focused resolve, the entire assault crumbled apart until the courtyard stood empty and silent once more. Well, Rosweiss said into the quiet that followed, something like grudging approval coloring her usually clipped tone. That was considerably more effective than I expected this early in your training. Issei let the balance breaker fade, breathing hard but steady on his feet. It was not the armor, he said. It was believing I had the right to use it. Rias's expression, watching him from across the courtyard, held something warm and fiercely proud beneath the lingering tension of the fight. That is the most important lesson anyone here could have taught you, Issei. I am glad you finally learned it. That evening, Zenobia found Issei cleaning a shallow cut along his forearm, a minor wound from the courtyard fight that had slipped past his armor in the chaos of battle. She sat across from him without asking, taking the cloth from his hands and finishing the work herself with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything. You fought well today, she said. Better than I expected this early into your balance breaker training. I had good teachers, Issei said. You included. Zenobia was quiet for a moment, focused on the wound. Can I tell you something I have not said to anyone else here? Always. I used to struggle with my faith, back before any of this happened, she said. Not in God's existence. In my own place within it. I was raised to believe my purpose was fixed, that I existed to serve a role decided for me long before I had any say in it. Meeting you and Asia and everyone at Co Academy taught me that purpose could be chosen instead of simply inherited. That lesson mattered more to me than I think I ever properly told you. I did not know that, Issei said quietly. I do not talk about it often, Zenobia admitted. But watching you these past months, refusing to let every faction fighting over your survival decide who you become because of it, it reminded me of that same lesson all over again. You are choosing your purpose in the middle of a catastrophe that tried to strip that choice away entirely. I find that worth fighting for, Issei. Not because the church assigned me to protect you. Because I believe, personally, that it matters. Issei looked at her, struck by the quiet sincerity beneath her usual blunt confidence. Thank you, Zenobia. For choosing that, even when it would have been easier not to. Easier is rarely worth choosing, Zenobia said, finishing the bandage with a firm, practical knot. There. Try not to let anything else slip past your armor tomorrow. I would rather not patch you up twice in 1 week. I will do my best, Issei said, smiling despite the day's exhaustion, grateful once again for the particular, steady kind of loyalty that had carried him through every difficult moment since the day he woke into this changed and dangerous world. The victory in the courtyard bought them time, but not peace, and the following week saw the fragile alliance between devils, fallen angels, and the church tested repeatedly by both external threats and internal friction. It was Irina who first noticed the pattern of small, quiet leaks, sensitive information about the facility's defenses surfacing in places it should never have reached, details that suggested someone within the alliance itself was passing information to outside parties. I do not want to believe it, Irina said, laying out her evidence carefully before Rias and Sona in a private meeting Issei had been asked to attend. But someone with access to our internal briefings has been in contact with remnants of the Sanctum Compact. I traced at least 2 incidents back to information that only a small circle of people should have had access to. Who? Rias asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. Irina hesitated, clearly reluctant to name names without absolute certainty. I cannot say for certain yet. But the circle is small enough that we should proceed carefully, and quietly, until we know who we are actually dealing with. The investigation that followed cast a shadow of suspicion over the facility that Issei found deeply unsettling, watching people he had come to trust regard each other with newly wary eyes, alliances built on careful diplomacy suddenly strained by the possibility of betrayal from within. It was Kaneko, methodical and quiet in her observations, who eventually identified the source, a junior aide within the church delegation who had been quietly compromised months earlier by Sanctum Compact operatives holding leverage over her family's safety. The confrontation, when it came, was quieter and sadder than Issei expected, the young aide breaking down in tears the moment Irina and Zenobia confronted her, admitting everything with the desperate relief of someone who had been carrying an unbearable weight alone for far too long. They said they would hurt my sister, she said, her voice shaking. I did not want to help them. I did not want any of this to happen. I am so sorry. Issei watched the scene with a complicated ache in his chest, understanding all too well the particular cruelty of a world reshaped by catastrophe, where even good people could be forced into impossible choices by those willing to exploit any leverage available. We will protect your sister, Rias said, her voice firm but not unkind. You made a mistake. But you also just gave us the chance to correct it before real damage was done. That matters. What happens to me now? The aide asked quietly. That is not entirely my decision, Rias said. But I will advocate for mercy, given the circumstances. Whatever the Sanctum Compact threatened you with, it was never a fair choice to begin with. Issei found himself grateful, watching the exchange, that the people leading this fragile alliance chose understanding over pure punishment wherever it was possible, a small mercy in the middle of a much larger, harsher conflict that showed no sign of granting the same grace to anyone caught within it. That night, unable to sleep after the day's revelations, Issei found Asia sitting alone in the facility's small chapel, a modest room set aside for quiet reflection that had become, over the past weeks, one of her favorite places in the entire compound. May I sit with you? He asked. Always, Asia said, making room beside her on the simple wooden bench. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the chapel's single stained glass window casting soft, fractured color across the floor in the moonlight. I keep thinking about that girl, Issei said finally. The aide who betrayed us. She was not evil. She was just scared, and someone used that fear against her. That is the hardest part of everything that has happened, Asia said quietly. The virus did not just take lives. It broke the world into pieces small enough for people to exploit each other over, out of fear, out of desperation, out of grief that never had time to heal properly. I do not think that girl is the only person caught in an impossible situation like that. I do not think she will be the last either. Does it ever feel like too much to you? Issei asked. All of it. The weight of trying to hold something broken this badly back together. Asia considered the question seriously, her hands folded in her lap. Sometimes, she admitted. But then I remember why I keep trying anyway. Because the alternative is letting the world stay broken, and I do not think either of us is built to accept that quietly. No, Issei agreed. I do not think we are. You have grown so much since you woke up, Asia said, studying him with a soft, open affection that made something warm settle in his chest despite the heaviness of the day. I know it does not always feel that way to you. But I see it. Everyone does. I could not have done any of it without all of you standing beside me, Issei said. That has not changed since the day I woke up. It never will. Asia smiled, quiet and genuine, and reached over to take his hand, a small, steady point of comfort in a world that offered so few of them freely anymore. Then let us keep standing together, she said. For as long as it takes. The dream came to Issei 3 nights after the confrontation with the compromised aide, vivid enough that he woke certain, for several long seconds, that it had been something more than an ordinary nightmare. In it, he had stood again in the courtyard among the cherry trees, except the blossoms had turned to ash the moment he reached for them, and Erivos' shifting form had loomed larger than it ever had in waking life, its layered voice speaking directly into the center of his chest rather than through the air around him. You believe your friends will always be enough, the voice had said. But even the strongest resistance eventually tires. Even the deepest loyalty eventually costs more than anyone is willing to pay. I have watched civilizations convince themselves otherwise for longer than your entire species has existed, and I have watched every single one of them learn the truth eventually. He woke with his heart pounding, the boosted gear flickering faintly along his arm in response to some instinctive alarm his sleeping mind had triggered without his full awareness. Partner, Drake said quietly, the moment Issei's eyes opened. That was not an ordinary dream. I felt something reach toward you through the bond, faint and distant, but real. Erivos may be testing whether it can influence you even from a distance. Can it? Issei asked, voice unsteady in the darkness of his room. Not easily. And not without consequence to itself, Drake said. But the attempt alone tells us something important. It is not as confident in its current position as its words in the courtyard suggested. Entities that secure in their power do not typically bother reaching into the dreams of an opponent they consider beneath serious concern. Issei sat with that thought for a long while, unable to fall back asleep, until a quiet knock at his door revealed Ria standing in the hallway, still dressed despite the late hour, her expression immediately sharpening with concern at the sight of him. You look like you saw something terrible, she said. I think I did, Issei admitted, and told her everything, the ash-covered blossoms, the voice pressing directly against his chest, Drake's theory about Erivos reaching toward him across some unseen distance. Rias listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening with every detail. That is deeply unsettling, she said when he finished. But Drake may be right that it reveals more weakness than strength. An entity secure in its plans does not need to unsettle its opponent's sleep. It does that when it fears losing ground it has not yet secured. It felt real, Rias, Issei said quietly. The fear it wanted me to feel. Some part of it still lingers. Rias sat down beside him without hesitation, her presence steady and warm against the lingering chill of the dream. Then let it linger, she said. Fear is not something you have to eliminate before you can keep fighting, Issei. You have been afraid since the moment you woke up in that hospital bed, and it has not stopped you from becoming exactly the person capable of standing against something like Arrivo's. Do not mistake fear for weakness. Sometimes it is simply proof that you understand exactly how much is at stake. Issei let out a slow breath, some of the tension easing from his shoulders at her words. Thank you for coming. I will always come, Ria said simply. Whatever reaches for you in the dark, Issei, you will never have to face it without someone beside you willing to answer that knock. They sat together until the first hints of dawn began to color the sky outside, and by the time Issei finally drifted back into an uneasy but undisturbed sleep, the ash-covered blossoms of the dream had faded from something monstrous into simply a warning, one more piece of information to carry forward into whatever fight still waited ahead. Azazel returned to the facility a week later with information that shifted the shape of everything they thought they understood about Arrivo's intentions. He arrived alone this time, uncharacteristically grim, and requested a private audience with Rias, Sona, and Issei before he would share what he had uncovered. I found an older record, Azazel said, spreading a set of ancient, fragile documents across the table with careful hands. Buried deep enough in the Grigori archives that even I had forgotten it existed until Sona's research team asked the right questions. It describes, in considerable detail, what an entity like Arrivo's actually wants from a survivor like Issei. Tell us, Ria said. Entities like Arrivo's do not simply erase populations out of malice, Azazel said. They cultivate extinction events specifically to isolate resistant genetic material, biological or magical traits so rare that ordinary circumstances would never allow them to be identified or extracted cleanly. In simpler terms, Issei's survival is not incidental to Arrivo's plan. It is the entire point of the plan. Arrivo's intends to use whatever protected you from the Sekai strain as the foundation for something new, a hybrid population engineered under its direct control, immune to the very weaknesses that made the original extinction event possible in the first place. The room went very quiet. Issei felt something cold settle into his stomach, the full implication of Azazel's words taking shape slowly and terribly. It does not just want to study me, Issei said. It wants to use whatever is inside me to build something else. Something it controls completely. That is my assessment, yes, Azazel said. And if that assessment is correct, it explains why Arrivo's has been patient rather than simply forcing the issue immediately after the Sekai strain finished its work. It needs you alive, cooperative if possible, and it needs whatever unique trait allowed you to survive intact enough to extract and replicate. That is not a fate any of us should allow to happen. We will not let it happen, Ria said, her voice carrying an edge of fierce, absolute certainty. Whatever it takes. Then we need to move from purely defensive preparation to something more proactive, Sona said, already turning the new information over with the same sharp strategic focus she brought to every problem. If Arrivo's is planning to make a direct attempt eventually, waiting for it to choose the timing works entirely in its favor. We should consider whether there is a way to disrupt its plans before it reaches that point. There may be, Azazel said. The same records that describe Arrivo's methods also describe the ritual site where the original Sekai strain was likely seated, a location that has been quietly monitored by Grigori scouts for the past several months without any of us realizing its significance. If Arrivo's maintains any ongoing connection to that site, disrupting it could weaken its ability to act against Issei directly. Issei looked around the table at the people who had become, over these strange and difficult months, something closer to family than allies. Then that is where we go next, he said. Before it decides it has waited long enough. The night before the final planning session began in earnest, Rias insisted on something the entire War Council had quietly needed without admitting it aloud, a simple shared meal, no strategy discussed, no reports reviewed. Just the people who had carried each other through months of escalating danger sitting together around one long table in the facility's dining hall. Ravel had coordinated with the kitchen staff to recreate dishes from before the catastrophe, familiar flavors that felt, for a few hours, like a small act of defiance against everything the world had lost. Aquino kept the table laughing with stories from her years coordinating border facilities. Tales exaggerated just enough to be entertaining without losing their grounding in genuine experience. Irina argued cheerfully with Zenobia over some minor point of church doctrine neither of them had thought about in years. Sona and Rosweiss traded quiet, dry observations that left Kaneko fighting a rare, visible smile. I do not think I have laughed this much since before I woke up, Issei admitted, watching the table with a warmth that eased some of the tension that had settled permanently into his shoulders over the preceding weeks. Good, Asia said, sitting beside him. We all needed this. Tomorrow will ask a great deal of everyone. Tonight, we are allowed to simply be glad we are still here together. Rias raised her glass partway through the meal, drawing the table's attention with the easy authority she had carried since long before any of this began. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, I want all of you to know how grateful I am. Not simply for your skill, or your strength, though both have carried us further than I once thought possible. For choosing to stand together, again and again, when every reasonable calculation might have suggested walking away instead. None of us were ever going to walk away, Aquino said, smiling. You should know us better than that by now, Rias. I do, Rias said, her voice softening. That is exactly why I am grateful. The table fell into comfortable warmth after that, conversation drifting easily between old memories and small, hopeful plans for whatever future waited on the other side of the coming fight. Issei looked around at each face in turn, Rias and Aquino, Asia and Kaneko, Zenobia and Irina, Ravel and Sona and Rosweiss, and felt, despite everything still ahead of them, a fierce and settled certainty that whatever Rivos intended, it would be facing something far stronger than a single survivor standing alone. It would be facing all of them, together, and that, Issei had come to believe completely, was a force worth every bit of hope the fractured world had quietly begun placing in it. Preparations for the assault on the ritual site consumed the following 2 weeks entirely, Sona's strategic planning combined with Rosweiss' combat expertise and Azazel's intelligence network producing a plan detailed enough to account for every contingency they could reasonably anticipate. Ravel's healing resources were mobilized and staged for rapid deployment. Irina secured formal church support for the operation, framing it in terms significant enough to overcome the lingering caution of more conservative clergy. Zenobia and Kaneko drilled the combat teams relentlessly, while Aquino coordinated magical support with a precision that left no detail unexamined. Issei spent those weeks training harder than he ever had before, the balance breaker becoming steadily more natural to summon and sustain, Drake's guidance sharpening every strike and movement into something approaching genuine mastery rather than desperate improvisation. Rosweiss pushed him through drills designed to test his control under exhaustion, insisting that any opponent as ancient as Arivos would look for exactly the moment his focus began to slip before pressing an advantage. Aquino paired with him for hours at a time, her lightning teaching him to read an opponent's gathering power before it fully released, a skill she promised would matter enormously against something capable of striking from angles a human-trained fighter would never think to defend. Kaneko worked with him on close-quarters recovery, teaching him how to reorient quickly after being thrown or grounded, a lesson she delivered with blunt, practical patience born from her own long experience absorbing blows that would have ended a lesser fighter. Zenobia sparred with him nearly every evening, her blessed blade teaching him to recognize the particular signature of attacks meant to bypass conventional defenses entirely, the kind of strikes Arivos' shifting, half-solid form seemed built to deliver. Even Ravel contributed, walking him through the early signs of magical exhaustion so that he would recognize the danger in himself before it became critical enough to risk his life needlessly. By the time Sona's final tactical briefing arrived, Issei felt, for the first time since waking into this altered world, something close to genuine readiness, not the desperate improvisation that had carried him through the courtyard skirmish, but a hard-won, deliberately built confidence forged through weeks of exhausting, unglamorous work. You are ready, partner, Drake said the night before the operation was set to begin. Or as ready as anyone facing something like Arivos can reasonably expect to be. The rest depends on how well you and your allies trust each other when the moment actually arrives. I trust them completely, Issei said, standing alone on the balcony outside his room, looking out over the courtyard one last time before the mission that would take them far from the facility's relative safety. I just worry about what it will cost them, fighting for me. That worry does you credit, Drake said. But do not let it become a burden heavy enough to slow you down when it matters most. They chose this fight freely, Issei. Respect that choice by giving everything you have in return, rather than second-guessing whether they should have made it at all. Rias found him there a few minutes later, her expression softer than the focused determination she had worn throughout the planning sessions. "You should be resting," she said, though she made no move to leave. "I could say the same to you," Issei said. She smiled, faint but genuine, and joined him at the railing. "Tomorrow is going to be difficult," she said. "I will not pretend otherwise. Whatever Rivos has protecting that site, it will not be undefended." "I know," Issei said. "But I also know I would rather face it with all of you beside me than let it continue building toward whatever it actually intends, unchallenged." "For what it is worth," Rias said quietly, "I am glad you woke up, Issei. Not because of what you represent to every faction fighting over your survival. Because the world is simply better with you in it. It always was." Issei felt something warm settle in his chest despite the weight of what awaited them the following day. "Thank you, Rias. For everything you have done to make sure I had the chance to prove that for myself." They stood together in comfortable silence after that, watching the moonlight settle over the cherry trees below, and when morning came, they left the facility together, united and resolved to meet whatever waited for them at the edge of the world the Rivos had tried so hard to reshape. The journey to the ritual site took the better part of a day, the strike team moving in careful stages through territory that had never fully recovered from the chaos of the Sekai strain's early months, abandoned towns giving way to overgrown highways and, eventually, to the dense, watchful forest Azazel's scouts had mapped so carefully in the preceding weeks. Issei spent much of the transport in quiet conversation with Drake, running through the theoretical limits of the balance breaker one final time, testing the edges of his own control before the fight that would demand every ounce of it. "You are steadier than you were even a week ago," Drake observed, as the transport rattled over a cracked stretch of road long since abandoned by any maintenance crew. "I would not have believed, watching you sleep for 4 years, that you would reach this level of command so quickly once you woke." "I had good reasons to move quickly," Issei said quietly, watching the ruined landscape pass beyond the window. "I do not think I had the luxury of taking my time relearning all of this slowly. Few of us ever do, in my experience," Drake said. "Urgency has a way of accelerating growth that patience alone rarely matches. Just remember, partner, speed without control is simply a faster way to make a fatal mistake. Whatever happens today, trust the discipline Rosweiss forced into you as much as the instinct that got you this far in the first place." Across the transport, Rias reviewed the operation's final details with Sona in low, focused tones, while Aquino checked her equipment with the same meticulous care she brought to every serious engagement. Zenobia sat with her sword across her lap, eyes closed, murmuring something too quiet for Issei to catch, a private ritual of her own before battles that mattered. Kaneko sat perfectly still beside her, radiating the calm, coiled readiness that had always made her such a steady presence in moments of high tension. Irina checked and rechecked a set of blessed talismans distributed among the church contingent, her usual cheerful energy tempered into something more focused and serious. Ravel remained near the rear of the transport, already organizing her healing supplies with practiced efficiency, while Rosweiss ran through contingency plans with the strike team's secondary units over a secure channel. Asia found her way to Issei's side as the forest finally came into view on the horizon, dense and unnaturally still even from a distance. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Issei admitted, seeing no reason to pretend otherwise with her. "But not the kind of afraid that makes me want to turn back. The kind that reminds me how much all of this actually matters." "That is the right kind of afraid to carry into something like this," Asia said, taking his hand briefly before the transport began its final approach. "I will be close throughout the fight. Whatever happens, you will not face any of it completely alone." "None of us will," Issei said, looking around at the assembled strike team one final time before the transport slowed to a stop at the forest's edge. "That is the only reason I believe we actually have a chance today." The team disembarked and practiced disciplined silence, spreading into the formation Sona had drilled into them over the preceding weeks, and as they moved deeper into the unnaturally quiet forest, the scorched, geometric patterns of the ritual site's outer boundary finally came into view through the trees ahead, exactly where Azazel's scouts had mapped it, and exactly as still and watchful as the reports had warned. The ritual site lay hidden within a forest that had grown unnaturally dense and silent in the years since the Sekai strain first swept across the world, the trees themselves seeming to lean away from a clearing at the forest's heart where the ground bore faint, scorched patterns too geometric to be anything but deliberate. Azazel's scouts had mapped the perimeter carefully, but nothing could have fully prepared the strike team for the sight that greeted them as they approached. Dozens of shadow constructs arrayed in careful defensive formation, more numerous and more coordinated than anything they had faced in the earlier courtyard skirmish. "That is considerably more than we anticipated," Rosweiss said grimly, assessing the formation with a tactician's practiced eye. "Then we adjust," Sona said, already directing the strike team into position through the earpiece each member wore. "Akino, Irina, take the left flank. Zenobia, Kaneko, center. Ravel, hold position for immediate healing support. Rias, Issei, you are with me on the right." We break their formation before it has a chance to coordinate a Rio response. The battle that followed was the largest and most brutal Issei had faced since waking, shadow constructs surging forward in disciplined waves while devils and church knights and fallen angels fought side by side with a coordination that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Akino's lightning tore through the left flank in devastating arcs. Zenovia's blessed blade and Kaneko's enhanced strength ground down the center formation strike by relentless strike. Issei, fully armored in the balance breaker, drove through the right flank with Rias and Sona at his side, each strike carrying the full certainty he had finally learned to claim as his own. It was deep within the clearing, past the last line of shadow constructs, that Arivos finally revealed itself again, its shifting form more solid this time, more clearly angered by the disruption of whatever process it had been quietly maintaining at the site for months. "You are more troublesome than I anticipated," Arivos said, the layered echo of its voice carrying real irritation now. "I had hoped to proceed with patience. You have made that considerably more difficult." "Then we are doing something right," Issei said, stepping forward, the boosted gear pulsing steadily along his armored arm. Arivos' shifting form gathered itself, dark energy coiling around it in patterns that made the air itself feel heavier, wrong in a way Issei's senses struggled to fully process. "You do not understand what you are interfering with, boy. What I offer, once complete, would ensure that nothing like the Sekai strain could ever threaten a population again. Your survival is meant to be the foundation of something permanent. Something safe. Safe under your control," Rias said sharply, power of destruction crackling around both hands. "That is not safety. That is a cage." "Perhaps," Arivos said, and something in its layered voice sounded almost thoughtful despite the danger radiating from its form. "Or perhaps it is simply the only kind of safety a species this fragile can actually sustain. We will see which of us is proven correct." The fight that followed tested every ounce of training the strike team had built over the preceding weeks. Arivos' power far exceeding anything the shadow constructs had demonstrated, each attack carrying enough force to send even Rias staggering when she failed to fully brace against it. But they fought together, not as isolated individuals but as a unit built on months of hard-won trust, Akino's lightning weakening Arivos' defenses long enough for Zenovia's blade to land solid, damaging strikes, Kaneko's strength driving the entity back long enough for Issei to gather the full force of a boosted strike behind his armored fist. When the final blow landed, driven by every ounce of certainty and resolve Issei had built since waking into this strange, broken world, Arivos' form fractured visibly, shadow bleeding away from its shifting edges in a way that finally looked like genuine damage rather than mere inconvenience. "This is not finished," Arivos said, its voice weaker now, retreating even as it spoke. "You have delayed the inevitable, nothing more. I will return, and next time, I will not underestimate what you have built here." And then it was gone, dissolving into the scorched earth of the ritual site as thoroughly as it had vanished from the courtyard weeks before, leaving the strike team standing bruised and exhausted but unmistakably victorious in the sudden, ringing silence that followed. For a long moment nobody spoke, the aftermath of the fight settling over the clearing like a held breath finally released. Akino lowered her hands, the last crackle of lightning fading from her fingertips. Zenobia sank to one knee, breathing hard, her blade planted in the scorched earth for support. Kaneko stood perfectly still, scanning the tree line out of long habit even though every construct had dissolved along with its master. Sona lowered her communicator slowly, as though only now allowing herself to believe the operation had actually succeeded. "Report," she said finally, her voice steadier than it had any right to be. "Injuries first." One by one the strike team called in their status, cuts and bruises and the deep, bone-tired ache of a fight pushed to its absolute limit, but nothing beyond what Ravel's healing could mend given time. Issei let the balance breaker fade at last, his legs nearly buckling the moment the armor's supporting weight disappeared, only for Rias to catch his arm before he hit the ground. "I have you," she said quietly, and Issei let himself lean into that support without a trace of the old embarrassment that might once have made him insist he was fine on his own. "We actually did it," he said, disbelief coloring the words even as the scorched ritual markings beneath his feet confirmed it plainly enough. "We did," Rias said, and for the first time in weeks, the smile she gave him carried nothing but simple, unguarded relief. The journey back to the facility carried a different weight than the one that had brought them to the ritual site, exhaustion mixed with the fierce, quiet satisfaction of a battle survived and, however temporarily, won. Ravel moved through the strike team methodically, her Phoenix healing techniques closing wounds and easing the deep bruising ache of a fight fought at the very edge of everyone's limits. "You did well," she told Issei, tending to a gash along his arm that had slipped past the balance breaker's defenses during the fight's most desperate moments. "All of you did. I do not think any of us truly believed we could drive Erivos back until it actually happened. It said it would return," Issei said quietly. "Stronger, and more prepared for what we have built. Then we will be stronger too, by the time it does," Ravel said simply. "You have already proven that this alliance can grow to meet whatever challenge it faces. I see no reason that will stop being true simply because the next challenge is larger than the last." Back at the facility, the War Council gathered one final time to assess the operation's outcome, the mood a careful balance of triumph and sober awareness that the larger conflict remained far from resolved. Azazel's analysis of the ritual site's remains suggested Erivos' plans had been significantly disrupted, though not entirely destroyed, and Sona's strategic team immediately began drafting proposals for how to press whatever advantage the victory had bought them. "We have time now," Rias said, addressing the gathered council with the quiet authority of someone who had earned every ounce of the trust placed in her over the preceding months. "Not unlimited time, but enough to prepare properly for whatever Erivos brings when it finally returns. I do not intend to waste a single day of that time." "None of us do," Sona agreed, and around the table, Aquino and Zenobia and Kaneko and Irina and Ravel and Rossweiss all nodded in unified, determined agreement. News of the strike team's victory at the ritual site spread through the surviving human and supernatural settlements faster than Sona's office had anticipated, carried first through official channels and then, inevitably, through the far less controllable rumor networks that connected isolated communities across the reshaped world. Azazel brought reports of the reaction personally, a rare, unguarded smile on his face as he described crowds gathering in quarantine zones to hear confirmed news that something capable of striking back against the forces behind the Sekai strain actually existed. "You have no idea what this means to people who have spent 4 years believing they were simply waiting for the next disaster to finish what the last one started," Azazel said. "Hope is not a strategic resource devils typically account for in their planning, but I promise you, it matters more than most of us like to admit. We did not do this for hope," Rias said, though her expression softened at the news regardless. "We did it to protect Issei, and to disrupt whatever Erivos intended." "Perhaps," Azazel said. "But intentions and consequences do not always align neatly, and in this case, I think the consequence matters just as much as the intention behind it. People needed a reason to believe rebuilding was worth the effort. You gave them one." Sona's office began fielding a steady stream of requests in the days that followed, delegations from human settlements and supernatural communities alike seeking to formally join the growing alliance, offers of resources and manpower arriving faster than the strategic team could properly evaluate them. It was, Sona noted during one of the War Council's final debriefings, both an enormous asset and a significant new challenge, an alliance now large enough to matter on a global scale, but also large enough to require careful, deliberate management if it hoped to remain effective rather than simply unwieldy. We built something today that is bigger than any of us anticipated when this started, Ria said, addressing the council with quiet satisfaction beneath her usual composed authority. That is a good problem to have, but it is still a problem we need to manage carefully going forward. One battle at a time, Rosweiss said. We handled the ritual site. We will handle whatever comes from managing this alliance's growth the same way, methodically, and together. Issei listened to the discussion with a strange, settled feeling in his chest, watching the shape of something larger than himself take form around the fight that had begun, months earlier, as a desperate attempt simply to keep him alive. It was no longer only about his survival, he realized. It had become something the entire fractured world had quietly decided to invest itself in, a resistance built not around one person's biology, but around a shared, stubborn refusal to accept that Arivos' version of safety was the only future left available to them. Later that evening, Issei found himself back on the same balcony where he had stood with Rias the night before the operation, watching the cherry trees below sway gently in the evening breeze, the same trees that had witnessed Arivos' first quiet visit weeks earlier. Asia joined him first, followed shortly by Kaneko, then Zenobia, then Aquino, until the entire balcony was crowded with the people who had fought and bled and trusted each other through everything the past months had demanded of them. We won today, Issei said, looking around at each of them in turn. But it does not feel finished. It is not finished, Ria said, joining them last, her expression carrying the same steady resolve she had worn since the day he first woke into this strange, reshaped world. But we proved something today that Arivos did not expect. That whatever it tries next, it will not be facing a scattered, fractured resistance. It will be facing all of us, together, and we do not intend to stop growing stronger until this is well and truly finished. Issei looked out over the courtyard, the cherry blossoms catching the last light of the setting sun, and felt, for the first time since waking into a world reshaped by catastrophe, something that felt unmistakably like hope. Then let it come back stronger, he said quietly. We will be ready. And around him, in the gathering dusk, the people who had become his family in every way that mattered stood together, unshaken, already turning their thoughts toward the harder fight still waiting somewhere ahead. Far beyond the reach of the facility's wards, in a place that existed at the edges of maps no living cartographer had drawn, Arivos gathered the fractured remnants of its damaged form and considered, with patient, ancient calculation, everything it had learned from the day's defeat. The boy had grown faster than its earlier observations suggested was possible, his allies more disciplined and more unified than the scattered, competing factions Arivos had originally calculated it would face. That miscalculation would not be repeated. It reached, in the quiet aftermath of its retreat, toward older fragments of power it had left dormant across the world long before the Sekai strain was ever seeded, resources set aside for exactly this contingency, in case the isolated survivor proved more resistant than a single, patient approach could overcome. Something ancient stirred in answer to that reaching, distant but unmistakable, a presence that had slept even longer than Arivos itself had walked among the fading civilizations of a world it intended to reshape entirely. They will need more than unity to survive what comes next, Arivos thought, gathering the last of its strength as its shattered form slowly began to knit itself back together in the darkness. I underestimated them once. I do not intend to make that mistake again. Somewhere far away, in a facility surrounded by cherry trees just beginning to lose their blossoms to the turning season, Issei Hyoudou slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, unaware of the ancient presence stirring in answer to Arivos' call, unaware that the hardest fight of everything still to come had not yet even properly begun.